Thank you for joining us. Glad to have you with us as we continue our study. We're looking today at the book of Hebrews. I invite you to turn, if you have Bibles or devices, to the first chapter of the book of Hebrews. We'll be taking a break from our study of Revelation, and should the Lord tarry, we'll pick it up again after the Christmas season. We're going to spend these next few weeks looking at the incarnation of Jesus and his birth and the significance thereof. The author of Hebrews does a great job of laying out for us the birth of Christ, and he approaches it from a slightly different lens. Where the Gospel of Luke looks at it from the lens of historical narrative, the Gospels of Mark and Matthew look at it more from the lens of history and Jewish history in particular. The author of Hebrews approaches it from, dare I say, a more philosophical standpoint. And he puts it in very grand terms as you look at the whole scheme of what the incarnation means for humanity. So with that in mind, if you have Bibles, again, devices, go ahead and feel free to look on in Hebrews chapter 1. The author begins, "In the past days God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways." We have to remember that a biblical definition of prophet is really kind of twofold. The first was, the prophet was almost always understood as having a filling or a gifting of the Holy Spirit. This comes out very evidently when Saul is crowned as the first king of Israel. And immediately the Spirit fills him, and Saul begins to prophesy, and people, onlookers, look at this and say, "Is now Saul one of the prophets?" And this idea, and we'll cover this actually in the next sermon series that I'll be doing after Revelation, we'll cover in greater length and detail the role that the Spirit plays in prophecy and how it is reflective of that. But for sure, the Old Testament really bears and sinks its teeth into this idea that the Spirit of God moving results in this prophesying phenomenon. So on the one hand, the prophet is understood as someone who is gifted with the Spirit. And the second piece is the prophet is understood as someone who speaks on God's behalf. Ancient culture, even to the modern day, we have press secretaries, we have spokesmen, we have ambassadors. We have numerous roles in society that mimic this idea of someone who speaks based on the authority or as a representation of others. Some of you know what it's like in the context of close relationships to have that bond with someone else where you can sit there and literally have a sense and know for certain that you know what the other person is thinking. An illustration I always love to use is watching sisters in particular interact. And sometimes the bond between sisters I find kind of comical because it's amazing how they can transition subjects and move back and forth, and they just never seem to miss a beat. They always seem to be on the same page. And that ability to stay on the same page is exactly the kind of what we would expect, if you will, from an Old Testament prophet. They were so in sync with God's views, God's values, God's perspective, that there was really no separation between what they said and what God says. They were endowed with the Spirit and given that authority to speak on God's behalf. And the author of Hebrews says that this was the method, this was God's chosen mode of communicating for literally centuries, for several millennials. For decades, God would raise up a prophet, a spokesman. Sometimes they took the role of or form of a Moses and carried on this ministry of teaching people the basic concepts and precepts of who and what God is and what his moral character looks like. Sometimes they come along, and particularly we see them arising during the time of the monarchy and the divided monarchy, and they would come as voices, as words of correction and rebuke to try to admonish the people to turn from their sinful ways. But the spokesman was always speaking on behalf of God. But the author of Hebrews notes that there is a tremendous contrast. Notice verse 2. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. This is one of the more fascinating verses, I think, in the New Testament. And there are several very important concepts that we're going to try to look at today, bring to life today. The first of these concepts is how the author of Hebrews positions the timetable that we're looking at. And he refers to the present age with this phrase, last days. We translate the phrase last days from the Greek word eschatos. And so when we think about end time studies, we're talking about eschatology. And it is the word to describe a period of time and the last period of time. So if a person were to approach me and ask, Pastor, are these the last days? I would say, absolutely. They have been since Pentecost. Peter grabs hold of the words of Isaiah, the words of Joel, the prophet, that in the latter days, these last days, God will pour out His Spirit, and your young men will have visions, and your old men have dreams, and so forth. And he lists then several criteria that evidence that this pouring out of the Spirit has occurred, and the pouring out of the Spirit is sequential and synonymous with the last days having come. So from really the first advent of Christ to the second, from his ascension to his return to earth, these are collectively, rightly understood to be the last days. We are living in the eschatos, the eschaton. There are several key passages in the Old Testament that clue us into what the eschatos, last times, are all about. The first one of these is found in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah really provides, I would argue, the bedrock teaching that many prophets would later pick up and add to, but it's really in the book of Isaiah that we come toe-to-toe with the concept of this phrase, last days. If you have a Bible in your Isaiah chapter 2, look down with me at the second verse. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the nations. It will raise above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. And the law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between nations. He will settle disputes between peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up nation against nation, and there will be no more war. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. When Isaiah lays out this prophecy, he pictures the time in the future. And he says in that time frame there's going to be dramatic changes. And one of the dramatic changes that Isaiah envisions is this mass streaming of people from all nations, and they will come to God. When we look at the Gospels, particularly in Luke's, and we see Jesus saying things like, I have come to seek and to save those who are lost, we see that God's envision, his intent is in these last days to seek from all the nations a people for himself. He is on mission, and that mission is redemption. And it is global in scope. Isaiah also in this prophecy foresees not just an age in which the nations will stream to God, but also a time in which God will rule over people. And so you really have, if you look carefully, a very close reading and understanding of the coming of Christ in his first advent, a time when he comes and he does teach the nations, a time when he comes and in the provision of his death and his sacrifice on the cross provides the means by which people can come to God and be saved and forgiven. And we see then in the second coming of Christ, when he will come and rule over the nations, when he will subdue all things, and he will lord over all the nations, and he will bring lasting peace. First coming, second coming. The first coming as teacher, the second coming as reigning king. The first time coming to provide the forgiveness of sins so that people can come to God. The last time really gathering his people as a people. This is what's happening. This is the plan. This is the desire and will of God for what should occur in these last days. And so we find ourselves as the church between the first advent and the second. We find ourselves being gathered from all the nations, and we await when the King will reign over those nations. Book of Hosea, chapter 3. Hosea invokes the same phrase, in these last days. Look with me at Hosea chapter 3, verse 5. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the mountain and to his blessings in the last days. Where Isaiah's vision is that of a mass gathering from all the nations, Hosea includes that specifically there will be an ingathering from amongst the Jewish people, from what we might call the chosen people. When later on the Apostle Paul would write the book of Romans, and even after that, when the Apostle John would write the book of Revelation, they are very emphatic that God is not yet done with his people, that there will yet remain a great ingathering of the Jewish nation, and Hosea himself envisioned that the coming of the Christ was, yes, going to fulfill that promise to Abraham to bless all the nations, to draw from all the nations, but it was also understood, and rightly understood, as a time in which God would prove that he is not done with his people, that he has remained faithful to Israel, even at times when Israel has remained unfaithful towards him. And he will, in fact, draw from the Jewish people some who will be redeemed. And Hosea pictures this massive ingathering from the house of Jacob, from the Jewish people. One more Old Testament passage, this one from the book of Micah. Micah chapter 4, verse 1. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the nations. It will rise above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Micah is almost quoting verbatim the prophecy of Isaiah. Many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we will walk in his paths, and the law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples, and he will settle many disputes for strong nations far and wide. They'll beat their swords into plowshares." Again, Micah comes back to the prophecy of Isaiah. He sees, as Isaiah did, this tremendous picture of the future where God would reach out to all the nations of the earth and draw people to himself. In other words, Isaiah and Micah foresaw us, the church. A multinational gathering of people from all the nations of the earth, well, most of the nations of the earth, gathered, redeemed, a people for God. That's us. Hebrews is writing, Hebrews is telling us that we live in these points, these times that we call the last days. And what characterizes this time as distinctive from the lens of Hebrews is not what God is accomplishing, but rather what God is using to communicate. You see, the program and the paradigm of God has always been to reach lost people and to draw people to himself. That has always been the objective, even in the Old Testament. But what's distinctive is now God is relying not upon spokesmen, the prophets, but now is communicating who he is through the Son. And it is a supreme, superlative form of communication. It's not just the great, it's the greatest. It's not just fantastic, it's the best. But in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. What makes the Son so much superior to the prophets? Hebrew gives us two thoughts. He's appointed the heir of all things, and through him, he made the universe. Now, what's fascinating is the author of Hebrew does not put these in chronological order. I kind of wish he would, because it would make more sense in the American mindset. But to just step back and think about the 2 points that are delineated here. The first point, historically, was creation. The Son was with God in creation, for the Son is God. Before anything was made, before anything came into existence, the Son was there. So not is he before all things, the author of Hebrews also points out, he is over all things. Notice the language that is used. He is appointed heir of all things. No prophet, no human being, even if they are given a word from the Lord, could ever claim what the Son has. No human could claim to have been there at the first shifting of the sand, at the first moment, the first dawn, the first day. To have viewed all that has transpired in earth, in human history, to know everything so completely, you would have to be God. And that's why the Son is over and above all of the prophets. He doesn't come with just a message from God. He comes as the messenger who is God. Verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. The Son is the radiance of God's glory. When the Hebrews pictured what they called the Shekinah glory of God, they always pictured it as marvelous light. You see that very evident in the time in which Moses would go into the tent of meeting. He would come face to face with God, and as he would leave the tent, they had to cover his face because it glowed so brightly that the people could not look upon it. That understanding of glory then was carried on even into the time of the temple. When they consecrate the temple, the Shekinah glory of God comes upon it, takes up residence there, and that is understood as the presence of God. God is wrapped in marvelous light. And this the Bible describes glory. And as light shines forth in beams, so the Scriptures describe the Son as radiating, as projecting forward the greatness and the glory of God. The prophets spoke of it, but the Son is it. I know that's not proper English, but bear with me. The Son is radiating, projecting forth God's glory, his greatness. And because of that, he can be said to be an exact representation of God. As human beings redeemed by God, in our best moments, we bear a likeness to God. And certainly the Old Testament prophets did as well. But the Son can be described not just as bearing some similitude to the God they served, but as an exact representation. He is a carbon copy of the original, if you will. Exact. There is no separation. There is no distinction. There is no space between how the Father would act, say, do, and will, than what the Son acts, says, wills, and does. He is a total extension, if you will, of the heart of the Father. And that is why in the Upper Room Discourse, when the disciples say, show us the Father, and Jesus says, have you not seen me before? Because if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. They are one and the same. They share so much in common. Not only is the Son the representation of the Father in his exact being, the Son is the one who sustains all things by the power of his word. I can't imagine holding everything together. You know, I've often reflected on the time of the Jewish people in their exodus, and I think, what person takes on the adoption of millions, perhaps, millions of people, pulls them out of slavery, and tries to turn them into a nation? I have trouble just managing and corralling, a few kids at the dinner table. And the thought of taking on all of that responsibility, the weight of all of that, it's incomprehensible to me. Think about the God who hears in this moment the pleas of 1,000 voices, the prayers of 1,000 voices, the sirens and the chaos that surround death and destruction and evil and war and famine and disease and everything that is happening right now on our planet somewhere. And the Father, the Son, know it all completely. Know every aspect of it, every inch of it, every ounce of it. And yet, holds it all together. We all know what it's like to be in circumstances where we feel like they are too big for us. We feel overwhelmed. But the Father the Son can bear the brunt of all that is wrong in the world and hold it together. Moving forward, after he, that is the Son, had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. And so he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. Two thoughts reign very heavily in this moment in the book of Hebrews. The first one is this idea of purification. The prophets could tell about God's forgiveness. The prophets could bear witness to the heart of God in his desire to redeem and to forgive. But the prophets in no way could provide the means of forgiveness. The prophets are the messenger. But Jesus is the substance of it all. The Son. The one who was there sustaining all things, the one who was there at creation, the one who stands to inherit at the end of time all things, is the one who provided purification for our sins. When we were early on in the book of Revelation, John hears a voice call out in the throne room, "Who is worthy to take the scroll and open it?" And they search the heavens above, they search the earth below, and they search the seas and the grave beneath. They find none. None is worthy. And as that is told to John, he begins to weep. And then he's told, "Lift your eyes. See the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Lamb that was slain. He is worthy to take the scroll, to break the seals, and to open it. And he is worthy because by his blood he has provided the forgiveness of sins." A prophet can tell you, but the Son can forgive you. The prophet can call out your sinfulness, but it's the Son who can forgive it. That is the distinct mediatorial role that the Son and the Son alone has. Moses could go into the tent and he could come out with words from God. He could come out with the instructions of God. He could come out with everything, and he could even come out with an elaborate scheme by which they could provide the supplication of sacrifices. But none can provide forgiveness. None can provide the true purification for sin. The blood of bulls and goats doesn't hack it, but the blood of the Son does. And because he was worthy, he is seated at the right hand in majesty and has become superior to all. When we think about the incarnation, we are talking about the incredible, powerful Son, the one who holds things together by the power of his words, by the one who was there before creation, the one who stands to inherit all things, the bookends of history. We're talking about the one who has come, who has provided the forgiveness of sins, and we're talking about taking all of that greatness, grandeur, radiance of glory, and cramming it into a very frail human body. I submit to you that the resurrection is not, in my opinion, the hardest miracle to come to grips with. I think the hardest miracle to wrap our minds around is, how did God become flesh? in true to form, both in the Gospels and here in the book of Hebrews, the Bible does not concentrate on how it came to be that the Son took on flesh. But the question is more of why. The Son came, the Son died, to usher in the last days, this day, what we oftentimes perhaps call the age of the church. Because it was only if the Son came and if the Son died that he could provide for the means for this age to occur, an age in which God will draw from all nations a people for himself, and will, in fact, also redeem from the house of Jacob as well, from Israel. We are the benefactors of that grace. We receive the blessings of that grace. But it's all made possible by the incarnation. If you do not have the coming of the Son, if you do not have the shedding of his blood at Calvary, you have no last days, and you have history moving aimlessly towards nothing and no consummate direction. But because the Son is and was and came and will come again, all that is possible that we see with God gathering a people for himself can take place because of the Son. The prophets could centuries ago see it, but it was dependent upon the Son to make it happen. And he did. God is on mission. God is gathering in this age, the last days, a people for himself. We are those people. And one day he will come and reign over his people. And that is the day we look forward to in the future. While I cannot explain to you all of how the incarnation happened, I can certainly tell you the why. We are the why. Pray with me if you would. Father, when you envisioned how you're going to draw creation and time to a close, you thought of us, your people. You thought about redemption and forgiveness and reconciliation for us, one to another, and to you as well. Father, thank you. Thank you that in the Son there is the provision for the purification of sin. Father, thank you that in the Son we can look upon him, hear his words, hear his teaching, and know that it exactly represents who you are. Father, thank you that you have redeemed us from the peoples of the earth to be a new nation, a holy people, your people. And Father, thank you for the glorious promise of the return of the King. We are a blessed people because you came and took on flesh. God, thank you. We give praise, we give glory and honor to your holy name. Amen.